Before we begin, I ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you these untold stories of the famous. In less than 60 seconds, a quiet Sunday in Los Angeles would turn into the day that shattered Keanu Reeves' body and reshaped his destiny forever. But first, there was the silence. The kind of perfect, suspended silence that exists only in the moments before everything changes. I was 24 years old, riding my 1986 Suzuki G6, our 750 through the Hollywood Hills on October 15th, 1988, completely unaware that I was living the last minutes of my old life. The morning had started with coffee in my cramped West Hollywood apartment, sunlight streaming through thrift store curtains onto walls covered with headshots and rejection letters. I remembered the taste of that cheap Colombian blend, bitter and strong, mixing with the scent of jasmine drifting through my always open windows. Everything felt possible that morning. My career was finally gaining momentum. Small roles, nothing spectacular, but enough to keep the dream alive. I just finished reading a script for an independent film, practicing monologues in my bathroom mirror, trying to find the truth beneath the words. The secret, my friend David had told me over beers the week before, is to never let them see you doubt yourself. Even when you're terrified, even when you have no idea what you're doing, you act like you belong. David was another struggling actor, but unlike me, he had that effortless confidence that seemed to open doors. We'd planned to meet that afternoon at a coffee shop in Beverly Hills to discuss the industry, our fears, our impossible hopes. I pulled on my worn leather jacket and grabbed my helmet. The weight of it felt reassuring, safety first, always. My mother's voice echoed across 3,000 miles. "Theodore, promise me you'll be careful out there." She still called me by my full name, Theodore Donald Keanu Reeves, the formal identity that felt too heavy for the person I was becoming in this city of reinvention. The bike started with that familiar rumble that vibrated through my chest. There's something spiritual about the relationship between a rider and his motorcycle. You're not separated from the world by metal and glass, but connected to it through speed, balance, and vulnerability. The machine responds to your touch like an extension of your own body, and for those moments of perfect synchronization, you feel invincible. I had no idea how quickly that feeling could shatter. The traffic was light for a Sunday, mostly tourists heading to the beach and locals running weekend errands. I loved riding through Los Angeles on Sundays. The city felt more forgiving, like it was taking a collective breath before the chaos of another week began. I took the scenic route through residential streets lined with palm trees and Spanish-style houses that looked like movie sets, past parts where families were having picnics while children played on swings. As I rode, I found myself thinking about the script I'd been studying. The character was a young man struggling with identity and purpose, themes that resonated deeply with my own experience. Acting wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about finding the parts of yourself that connected with the character, then amplifying those traits until they became visible to an audience. Every role was a form of self-discovery. The engine hummed beneath me, a mechanical heartbeat matching my own pulse. I've been riding for almost 2 hours, lost in the meditation of movement, when I realized I was running late. David would be sitting at the coffee shop already, checking his watch with that patient smile he wore when I inevitably showed up behind schedule. I decided to take Sunset Boulevard, a more direct route that would get me there faster. The traffic was heavier now, cars filled with people heading to brunch, to shopping, to whatever Sunday adventures awaited them. I merged into the flow of vehicles, maintaining a safe distance, always aware of my vulnerability in the space between metal and momentum. That's when I saw her, an elderly woman in a blue sedan, her silver hair barely visible above the headrest. She was driving with the careful precision that comes with age and experience, in the lane next to me, traveling at the same speed. Something about her reminded me of my grandmother, the same dignified posture, the same thoughtful attention to the road ahead. What I didn't know was that she was having a moment of confusion. Later, investigators would piece together the sequence of events. A prescription medication that affected her reflexes, a split-second off disorientation, a gentle but decisive turn of the steering wheel that would change two lives forever. But in that moment, none of that had happened yet. The sun was still shining, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The engine was still humming its steady rhythm. And I was still that young actor who believed he could navigate the future as smoothly as he navigated traffic, still blessed with that particular blindness that allows us to believe we can outrun fate itself. I remember checking my watch, 2:17 p.m. I remember the feel of the handlebars beneath my gloves, the slight vibration that traveled up through my arms. I remember thinking about David, about the conversation we'd have over coffee, about the audition I had scheduled for Tuesday morning. Normal thoughts, ordinary concerns. The mental soundtrack of a life that was about to be interrupted by the sound of grinding metal and the terrible silence that follows impact. Friends who knew me then would later say they'd never seen someone so comfortable on amateur cycle. I've been riding since I was 16, had never had so much as a minor spill. My reflexes were sharp, my attention focused, my protective gear properly secured. I was doing everything right, following every safety protocol I'd learned over 8 years of riding. But sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. Sometimes the universe decides to remind you that control is an illusion, that all our careful planning and protective measures are just ways off whistling in the dark while we walk through a world where anything can happen to anyone at any time. The blue sedan began to drift into my lane. It happened slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like a ship changing course on a calm sea. I had to notice it, time to feel the first flutter of concern, time to ease off the throttle and prepare to adjust my position. This was the kind of minor traffic situation I'd navigated hundreds of times before: inattentive drivers, momentary lapses in concentration, the small miscommunications that happen when humans try to share space at high speeds. But this time was different. This time, the sedan kept coming. I could see the woman's profile now, her expression distant, unfocused. She wasn't looking in mid-erection, wasn't checking her mirrors, wasn't performing any of the visual confirmations that drivers are supposed to make before changing lanes. She was simply turning the wheel, following some internal compass that had stopped pointing towards safety. My training kicked in. Check your escape routes. Signal your presence. Assume the other driver hasn't seen you. I tapped my horn, not aggressively, just a gentle notification that I was there, sharing the road, hoping to snap her back to awareness. She didn't respond. The sedan continued its inexorable drift toward my lane, toward the space I occupied, toward the collision that would split my life into before and after. I had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died, whether I walked away or spent months in a hospital bed, whether the dreams I'd been chasing would survive the impact or be scattered across Sunset Boulevard like broken glass. 3 seconds. In motorcycle training, they teach you that 3 seconds is enough time to avoid almost any collision if you make the right choice. Brake hard and straight. Swerve left into the shoulder. Accelerate past the danger zone. Calculate the angles. Trust your reflexes. Commit to your decision completely. But they don't teach you what to do when all the options lead to disaster. When braking means being crushed by the car behind you. When swerving left means hitting oncoming traffic. When accelerating forward means racing toward a concrete barrier that's rushing up fast. They don't teach you what it feels like when time slows down and speeds up simultaneously. When your mind becomes hyper-aware of every detail, while your body moves through space according to laws of physics you can't override. They don't teach you about the strange clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis, when the chaos of daily life falls away and you're left with nothing but the essential mathematics of survival. The blue sedan was 3 feet away, 2 feet, 1 foot, and then contact. The initial impact was almost gentle, like a tap on the shoulder from an old friend. Metal kissed metal with a soft, scraping sound that seemed absurdly polite given what it said in motion. For a microsecond, I thought I might be able to maintain control, to ride out whatever was about to happen and continue on my way with nothing more than a scratch fender and an interesting story to tell David over coffee. But physics had other plans. The gentle kiss became a violent embrace, as the sedan's momentum transferred to my motorcycle, sending me into a wobble that quickly became a tank slapper, the handlebars jerking left and right with machine gun precision while I fought to maintain any semblance of control. The bike wanted to throw me off, to rid itself of the biological component that was no longer helping with the task of staying upright. I held on. I held on because that's what riders do, because 8 years of experience had trained my muscles to grip tighter when things went wrong, because letting go felt like giving up and I wasn't ready to give up. Not on the bike, not on my career, not on the future I'd been building one small rollie at a time. But the bike was already deciding for me. The rear wheel lost traction, sliding sideways across asphalt that suddenly felt as slippery as ice. The world tilted at an impossible angle, and I realized with perfect clarity that I was no longer riding a motorcycle. I was simply along for whatever ride the laws of physics had planned for me. The last thing I remember thinking as the ground rushed up to meet me at 45 miles per hour was how quiet everything had become. The engine noise, the traffic sounds, the ordinary audio of a Sunday afternoon in Los Angeles. All of it had been replaced by a profound silence that seemed to originate from somewhere deep inside my chest. Later, doctors would tell me about the injuries: shattered ribs, punctured lung, torn ligaments, damaged vertebrae, cuts and bruises that mapped the exact trajectory of my impact with the asphalt. Later, insurance investigators would diagram the accident with mathematical precision, calculating speeds and angles and points of contact until the chaos was reduced to neat columns of data. Later, I would learn that the elderly woman in the blue sedan was unhurt, that she'd stopped immediately and sat in her car, crying until the paramedics arrived, repeating over and over, "I didn't see him." I looked and I looked, but I didn't see him. But first, there was the silence. The complete, perfect silence that exists in the space between one life and the next, between the person you were and the person you're about to become. I lay on Sunset Boulevard, breathing carefully around ribs that felt like broken glass, staring up at a California sky that looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. When I'd been invincible and immortal and entirely unprepared for the lesson, I was about to learn about the fragility of everything we think we can count on. Why I didn't know, couldn't know, was that this moment of destruction would eventually become the foundation of everything that mattered most in my life. That the silence spreading through my chest would teach me to listen more carefully to the people around me. That the pain radiating through my broken body would make me more sensitive to suffering wherever I encountered it. In 60 seconds, everything had changed. But the real transformation, the one that would reshape not just my career, but my entire understanding of what it means to be human in a world where suffering is universal and compassion is a choice. That transformation was just beginning. The first sound that penetrated the silence was a voice. Female, urgent, professional. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me? Don't try to move. We're going to take care of you." I tried to respond, to tell her that I was conscious, that I could hear her perfectly well, but when I opened my mouth, only a thin wheeze escaped. It felt like someone had filled my chest with broken glass and razor wire. Each breath was an act of negotiation with physics. How much air could I take in before the pain became unbearable? "Possible pneumothorax," the voice continued, speaking to someone I couldn't see. "And look at his left side, multiple rib fractures, definitely. Get me in 4 started and call for a spinal board. Now." Pneumothorax. I knew that word from somewhere, maybe from a medical drama I'd watched between editions. Collapsed lung. The knowledge should have terrified me, but I felt strangely detached from the information, as if we were discussing someone else's medical emergency rather than my own rapidly deteriorating condition. I became aware of movement around me. People kneeling, hands touching my body with careful precision, voices coordinating a response to the crisis of my broken anatomy. Someone was cutting away my leather jacket, the jacket I'd been wearing when I left my apartment that morning, full of hope and plans and the casual assumption that I would return home safely. "What's his name?" a different voice asked. "Anyone know his name?" "The woman in the sedan says he's an actor," someone replied. "Keanu something. Keanu Reeves. An actor." as if that somehow made the injuries more or less significant, as if my profession could influence how quickly my lung would reinflate or how straight my ribs would heal. But I understood the impulse to categorize, to make sense of chaos by fitting it into familiar boxes. Actor equals someone who takes risks for entertainment. Actor equals someone whose body is both tool and commodity. Actor equals someone whose ability to work depends entirely on physical functioning. The sky above me was impossibly blue, the kind of perfect California blue that makes you understand why people move here from places where the weather has moods and seasons. It was the same sky I'd been riding under just minutes earlier when my biggest concern was being late to meet David. Now it felt like I was looking at it through a telescope, distant and untouchable, a reminder of a world that continued to exist despite my personal catastrophe. Keanu, can you wiggle your toes for me? The question sent a jolt of terror through my drug-addled consciousness. I tried to focus on my feet, try to send the mental command that should result in movement. For a moment that lasted forever, I felt nothing. No response, no sensation, no confirmation that the neurological pathways between my brain and my extremities were still functioning. Then, finally, a slight movement, barely perceptible, but there. "Good," the paramedic said, and I could hear genuine relief in her voice. "That's very good. We're going to get you to the hospital now, okay? Just stay with us." The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and ceiling lights and medical conversations conducted in that clipped, professional language that healthcare workers use when someone's life is hanging in the balance. I drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally surfacing to catch fragments of discussion about blood pressure and oxygen saturation and the wisdom of administering pain medication tosimione with potential spinal injuries. The pain was extraordinary, not just in its intensity, but in its comprehensiveness. Every system in my body seemed to be reporting damage simultaneously, ribs grinding against each other with each breath, muscles spasming in response to trauma, nerves firing random signals that my brain interpreted as everything from burning to tearing to crushing pressure. But worse than the physical pain was the growing awareness of what this meant for my future. At 24, I was finally beginning to establish myself as a working actor. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would make me famous, but enough to pay rent and occasionally eat in restaurants instead of surviving on ramen and optimism. Now, lying on a gurney with unknown injuries, tongue-known parts of my body, the future felt as fragile as everything else I'd taken for granted. Cedars-Sinai Medical Center received me like a broken package, efficiently sorting through the damage and prioritizing the repairs. Doctors who later confirmed they'd never heard my name moved around my bed with practiced urgency, ordering x-rays and blood tests and consultations with specialists whose job it was to assess just how badly I'd managed to break myself. "Mr. Reeves?" The voice belonged to a doctor who looked barely older than me, his face serious but kind. "I'm Dr. Martinez, the attending physician in the trauma unit. You've been in a motorcycle accident. Do you remember what happened?" I tried to speak, managed a croak that might have been yes. The blue sedan, the moment of impact, the feeling of flying through space with no control over my destination. I remembered everything, wished I could forget some of it. "You have multiple injuries that we're still assessing," Dr. Martinez continued. "Definitely several broken ribs, possibly a punctured lung, and we're concerned about potential spinal trauma. We need to run some tests, get some pictures of what's happening inside. Is there someone we should call? Family? A girlfriend? Family." The word hit me like another collision. My mother, 3,000 miles away in Toronto, going about her Sunday evening completely unaware that her youngest child was lying in a Los Angeles emergency room trying to remember how to breathe properly. She would be devastated, not just by the accident, but by the fact that I was going through this alone, that she couldn't be here to hold my hand and tell me everything would be all right. "My mother," I whispered. "Patricia Taylor." In Toronto, the next few hours dissolved into a pharmaceutical haze punctuated by moments of startling clarity. X-ray machines hummed above me like mechanical vultures, their electronic eyes seeing through skin and muscle to catalog the destruction beneath. Technicians wheeled me from room to room with the detached efficiency of people who dealt with broken bodies every day, their casual conversations about weekend plans and cafeteria food creating a surreal soundtrack to what felt like the most significant experience of my life. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was both better and worse than I'd feared. For broken ribs, two of them badly displaced, a partially collapsed lung that would require a chest tube to reinflate properly, severe soft tissue damage across my left side where I'd impacted the asphalt, torn ligaments in my lower back, a concussion that explained why the world occasionally tilted at impossible angles when I tried to focus. But no permanent spinal damage, no paralysis, no injuries that couldn't heal given enough time and physical therapy and the kind of patience I'd never been particularly good at. Dr. Martinez delivered this news with the careful optimism of someone who'd seen enough trauma talk know that could have been worse was often the best possible outcome. You're going to be in significant pain for several weeks, he explained. The ribs will take time to mend, and the lung injury means we need to monitor you carefully for the next few days. But there's no reason to believe you won't make a full recovery. Full recovery. The words should have been reassuring, but they raised questions I wasn't ready to confront. Recovery to what, exactly? To the person I'd been that morning, riding through Los Angeles with casual confidence in my own invincibility. That person felt like someone I'd known long ago, Afrian from childhood whose face I could barely remember. My mother's voice came through the hospital phone like an anchor thrown from a great distance. Theodore? Oh my God, Theodore, are you all right? The sound of her saying my real name, not the shortened version I used professionally, not the nickname my friends had adopted, but the full formal name she'd given me at birth, broke something inside me that had been holding steady since the accident. For the first time since impact, I started to cry. Mom, I managed, the word thick with exhaustion and medication, and the overwhelming relief off hearing someone who loved me unconditionally, who would care about my well-being whether I ever acted in another movie or not. Mom, I'm hurt pretty bad. I know, sweetheart. I know. I'm getting on the next flight to Los Angeles. I'll be there as soon as I can. You just rest, okay? Just rest and get better. She was crying too. I could hear it in her voice, that particular tremor that comes when mothers confront the terrible fragility of their children's lives. She would drop everything, her job, her responsibilities, her own comfort, to sit beside a hospital bed in a city she'd never liked, watching over a son who'd chosen to chase dreams that required him to live 3,000 miles away from everyone who truly knew him. After we hung up, I lay in the dim hospital room, listening to the machines that were monitoring vital signs. The regular beeping was oddly comforting, a mechanical heartbeat that confirmed I was still alive, still functioning, still capable of repair. Through my window, I could see the lights of Los Angeles stretching toward the horizon, millions of people going about their Sunday evening routines completely unaware that one young actor's understanding of existence had just been fundamentally altered. David appeared the next morning, carrying coffee and wearing an expression of shock that I would remember for years afterward. He'd heard about the accident through that mysterious network of gossip and concern that connects struggling actors in Los Angeles, and he'd driven straight to the hospital as soon as visiting hours began. Jesus, Keanu, he said, settling into the chair beside my bed. When I heard, I thought, I didn't know how bad it was. I tried to smile, which hurt more than I'd expected. Everything hurt more than I'd expected. Worse than it looks, I croaked. That's impossible, David replied, but his attempt to humor fell flat. He looked genuinely shaken, as if seeing me connected to tubes and monitors had forced him to confront his own mortality in ways Hugh isn't prepared for. The doctors say you're going to be okay, though. Full recovery. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the strange awkwardness of the situation. David and I had spent months talking about our careers, our ambitions, our plans for conquering Hollywood. Now those conversations felt abstract, almost silly, like children discussing what they wanted to be when they grew up while standing in the ruins of a bombed city. I keep thinking, I said eventually, about how random it was. 5 seconds earlier or later, and nani off this happens. The woman never drifts into my lane, or she does it when I'm not there, or I take a different route entirely. Just tiny changes that would have left me sitting in that coffee shop complaining about being late, drinking overpriced coffee, and talking about auditions. David nodded. But you didn't take a different route. And here you are. Here I was. Broken but breathing, damaged but not destroyed, facing a recovery that would take months and leave scars that would last forever. But also facing something else. A new awareness of just how precarious all our plans and dreams really are. How quickly the life we think we're building can be interrupted by forces completely beyond our control. My mother arrived that evening, red-eyed from crying and travel, carrying a small suitcase, and that particular expression of determined competence that mothers wear when their children are in crisis. She took one look at me, bandaged, intubated, connected to machines, and I watched her face crumple for just a moment before she composed herself. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, taking my hand with infinite gentleness. "My brave, foolish boy." Having her there changed everything. Not the medical reality of my injuries, not the timeline of my recovery, but the fundamental emotional context of what I was going through. I wasn't alone anymore, wasn't just another patient in a trauma ward. I was someone's son, someone whose well-being mattered desperately to another human being. That night, as my mother dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened to me. The accident had been random, meaningless, the kind of statistical inevitability that happens when millions of people share roads with vehicles that can kill them. But the aftermath, the pain, the fear, the forced confrontation with my own fragility felt like it might be leading somewhere important. For the first time in my life, I understood viscerally that nothing was guaranteed. Not my health, not my career, not my assumption that I would wake up each morning with the same abilities I'd gone to sleep with. Everything I'd taken for granted, the simple act of breathing without pain, the ability to move through the world under my own power, the luxury of planning for a future that might actually arrive, all of it was contingent on forces I couldn't control or predict. But instead of feeling helpless, I felt strangely awakened, as if the accident had cracked open some protective shell I'd been carrying around my heart, letting in light and air and a new kind of sensitive attitude the experiences of everyone around me. Every nurse who checked my vital signs, every orderly who helped me to the bathroom, every patient in the beds nearby, they were all navigating their own relationships with pain and vulnerability and the basic human need for compassion in difficult times. The crash had broken my body, but it had also broken open something else. A recognition that suffering wasn't an aberration or a punishment, but simply part of the human condition. And if that was true, if pain and fragility and the constant possibility of loss were woven into the basic fabric of existence, then maybe the most important thing I could learn wasn't how to avoid suffering, but how to meet it with grace. Lying in that hospital bed, breathing around broken ribs, and feeling the slow burn of healing tissue, I began to understand that the accident hadn't just interrupted my life. It had given me access to a depth of experience that I'd been too young and too protected to reach before. The person I'd been that Sunday morning, confident, eager, slightly naive, was gone forever. But the person I was becoming might be capable of things that the old me had never even imagined. The transformation was just beginning, and it would take years to fully understand what the accident had set in motion. But already, in those first days of recovery, I could feel something shifting inside me. A new awareness of how connected we all are in our vulnerability, how much courage it takes just to keep showing up for life when life has demonstrated its capacity to change everything in an instant. Outside my hospital window, Los Angeles continued its endless sprawl toward the horizon, full of dreamers and strivers, and people like me who'd come here believing they could control their own destinies. Most of them would never experience what I'd just been through. The sudden, violent reminder that control is an illusion and survival is a gift. But for those who did, for those who found themselves broken and healing in places they'd never expected to be, maybe there was something valuable waiting in the wreckage. Something that can't be learned any other way. something that would make them more fully human than they'd ever been before. I was 24 years old, lying in a hospital bed with a chest full of broken ribs and a future full of uncertainty. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever it was, I would meet it with a new understanding of what it meant to be fragile and strong at the same time, damaged and whole, broken and somehow, impossibly, more complete than I'd ever been before. The real test began 3 weeks later, when I was finally cleared to leave the hospital. Standing in my West Hollywood apartment for the first time since the accident, I felt like an intruder in my own life. Everything looked exactly the same. The thrift store curtains, the headshots on the wall, the coffee cup I'd left unwashed in the sink that Sunday morning. But I was fundamentally different, and the disconnect between my changed self and my unchanged environment was disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. My mother had extended her stay to help me navigate those first weeks of recovery at home. She moved through my apartment with quiet efficiency, organizing medications, preparing meals, creating the kind of structured routine that would support healing. But I could see the worry in her eyes every time she looked at me, the careful assessment of my mood and energy levels that came from Amethyst's instinct to protect her child from further harm. "Theodore," she said one morning as I struggled to put on a shirt without triggering the sharp pain that still radiated from my ribs, "have you thought about maybe coming home for a while? Just until you're feeling stronger." Home. Toronto. The city I'd left 2 years earlier, full of ambition and determination to make something of myself in Los Angeles. Going back now felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that an accident had broken more than just my body. It had broken my ability to survive independently in the city where dreams were supposed to come true. "I need to be here, Mom," I said, though the words fell hollow even as I spoke them. "My career, my contacts, everything I've been building, it's all here." But was it? The audition I'd missed while unconscious in the hospital had gone to another actor. My agent had stopped returning my calls with the same frequency, his assistant's voice carrying that particular tone of professional sympathy that really meant, "We're not sure you're viable anymore." The momentum I'd been building, role by small role, had been completely interrupted by months off medical appointments and physical therapy sessions. Friends who knew me before the accident later described the change as startling. Keanu had always been this quiet, focused presence, recalled casting director Sarah Chun, who'd worked with me on several auditions. But when I saw him 6 months later, there was something deeper there. More weight. You could see that life had touched him in ways that most 24-year-olds never experience. The physical therapy was its own kind of purgatory. 3 times a week, I reported to a clinic in Beverly Hills where a cheerfully determined woman named Maria guided me through exercises designed to restore mobility and strength to my damaged body. Every session was a confrontation with my limitations, a precise measurement of how far I'd fallen from the physical competence it'd taken for granted. "Lift your left arm as high as you can," Maria would instruct, and I would strain to reach a height that had once required no conscious effort. The simple act of raising my arm above my shoulder became a monumental achievement that left me exhausted and frustrated. The resistance bands she used were color-coded by difficulty level. Yellow for beginners, red for intermediate, black for advanced. Before the accident, I could have handled the black bands without breaking a sweat. Now, the yellow resistance left me trembling with effort, my body reminding me with every repetition that strength was not something I could take for granted anymore. Recovery isn't linear, Maria reminded me during particularly difficult sessions. Some days will be better than others. Some days will feel like you're moving backward. But the trend, over time, will be toward improvement. But improvement toward what? That was the question that haunted my sleepless nights and colored every interaction with friends who didn't quite know how to treat me anymore. Would I recover enough to perform the kind of physical roles that had been defining my nascent career? Would casting directors take a chance on an actor who'd spent months in rehabilitation? Would I ever feel comfortable on a motorcycle again? Or had that particular source of joy and meditation been permanently severed by the memory of metal scraping against asphalt? The motorcycle sat in my apartment's parking lot, untouched since the day of the accident. My insurance company had retrieved it from the scene. Surprisingly, it was less damaged than I was. A few scratches, a bent handlebar, nothing that couldn't be repaired with a few $100s in a weekend in a garage. But every time I looked at it, I felt a complex mixture of longing and terror that I couldn't quite resolve. David visited regularly, bringing news from the industry that felt simultaneously vital and irrelevant. He'd landed a recurring role on a television series, the kind of steady work that every struggling actor dreams of. His career was ascending while mine was in suspended animation. And though he never said anything directly, I could sense his discomfort with the growing disparity in our professional circumstances. "There's a casting director I've been working with," he mentioned during one visit, his tone carefully casual. "She's looking for actors with more depth, more life experience. I mentioned you, told her about what you've been through." "What I've been through?" As if the accident was now part of my professional identity, a credential that might make me more interesting to people who made their living deciding which faces would appear on screens. The idea was both appealing and deeply troubling, that my suffering might be commodified, turned into a career advantage that justified the pain and uncertainty I was still navigating. "Maybe," I said, though the prospect of walking into an audition room and having to explain the gaps in my resume felt overwhelming. "When I'm ready." But when would that be? Weeks passed, then months, and I found myself trapped in a strange liminal space between the person I'd been and the person I was becoming. Too injured to fully participate in the competitive athletics of Hollywood audition culture, but too proud to simply give up on the dreams that had brought me to Los Angeles in the first place. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of recovery. Most of my relationships in Los Angeles were built around shared professional ambitions. Actors supporting each other through the endless cycle of auditions and rejections, bonding over the common struggle to survive financially while pursuing artistic fulfillment. But when you're no longer actively participating in that struggle, when your days are structured around medical appointments rather than casting calls, those relationships naturally begin to fade. Friends would call less frequently, not out of malice, but because they were busy with the industry activities that no longer define my daily routine. Invitations to industry events became less common, partly because my limited mobility made social gatherings exhausting, but also because I was no longer perceived as a useful networking contact. In Hollywood, relevance is currency, and mine had been significantly devalued by months away from the game. My agent, when he finally returned one of my calls, was diplomatically honest about the challenges he was facing. "Look, Keanu," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of sympathy and pragmatism that characterizes Hollywood business relationships. "The industry moves fast. People have short memories, but they also have immediate needs. Right now, you're not available in the way that casting directors need their actors to be available." He was right, of course. I couldn't commit to the physical demands that many roles required. I couldn't work the long hours that independent films demanded. I couldn't even sit through a 3-hour audition without needing breaks to manage the pain that still flared up unpredictably. By the practical standards of the entertainment industry, I was damaged goods. There were nights when I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of Los Angeles outside my window, wondering if I should have accepted my mother's suggestion to return to Toronto. Maybe a complete break from the city would allow me to heal more completely, to rebuild myself without the constant reminder of the career that seemed to be slipping away while I focused on learning to breathe properly again. But something in me resisted that impulse toward retreat. Not stubbornness, exactly, though that was certainly part of it. Something deeper, a growing understanding that the accident hadn't just changed my body, it had changed my relationship with difficulty itself. The pain I was experiencing, both physical and emotional, wasn't an obstacle to overcome so much as information to process. Data about resilience, about the capacity to endure, about what it meant to rebuild yourself from the inside out. During one particularly difficult physical therapy session, as I struggled to complete a series of exercises that would have been trivial before the accident, Maria made an observation that shifted something fundamental in my understanding of what I was going through. "You keep comparing yourself to who you were before," she said, watching me attempt to lift a 10-pound weight with my left arm. "But that person is gone. He existed in a different body, with different limitations, different knowledge about what's possible and what's fragile. The question isn't whether you can become him again. The question is whether you can become someone better. Someone better." The phrase lodged in my consciousness like a seed planted in fertile soil. What if the accident hadn't simply interrupted my trajectory, but had redirected it towards something more significant than I'd been capable of imagining before? What if the suffering I was enduring was actually preparation for a kind of work, both artistic and personal, that required a deeper understanding of human vulnerability than I'd possessed at 24? Late at night, when the pain medication made sleep elusive and my mind wandered through the landscape of possibility, I began to conceive of a different relationship with my career. Instead of seeing acting as a way to escape myself, to disappear into characters who were more confident, more physically capable, more emotionally straightforward than I was, maybe I could use it as a way to explore the complexity of being human in a world where everyone was carrying some form of invisible damage. The accident had given me access to experiences that most people my age never encountered. The terror of losing control completely, the humility of depending on others for basic survival, the strange intimacy that develops between people who are helping each other navigate crisis. These weren't pleasant experiences, but they were profound ones, and they were changing me in ways that might ultimately make me a more interesting artist. My relationship with my mother deepened during those months of recovery in ways that surprised both of us. She had flown to Los Angeles expecting to provide basic care for her injured son, but what developed was a more complex dynamic of mutual discovery. She saw me confronting adult challenges with a maturity she hadn't realized I'd developed, and I saw her navigating an unfamiliar city and culture with courage that reminded me where I'd inherited my own resilience. "You're different now," she told me one evening as we sat in my apartment, both of us reading, she with a novel she'd picked up at the airport, me with a script I was considering for my eventual return to auditions. Not worse, not better necessarily, just different, more serious, more aware. She was right. The casual confidence I'd carried before the accident had been replaced by something more complex, a hyper-awareness of fragility that coexisted with a growing appreciation for the simple fact of being alive. Every breath that didn't hurt, every morning I woke up without the stabbing pain in my ribs, every day I could move through my apartment without assistance. These became small victories rather than basic assumptions. The motorcycle remained untouched in the parking lot, but I found myself thinking about it differently. Not as a source of fear, exactly, but as a symbol of the choices I would eventually have to make about risk and safety and the kind of life I wanted to live. Would I allow the accident to define the boundaries of my future experience? Or would I find a way to integrate the hard-won wisdom of survival with the courage to continue taking meaningful risks? 6 months after the accident, I attended my first audition since the crash. It was for a small independent film, the kind of project I'd been pursuing before my life was interrupted by flying through the air at high speed. The character was a young man dealing with loss, trying to rebuild his life after everything familiar had been taken away. The parallels to my own situation were obvious, almost too obvious, but I needed the work and the practice of presenting myself professionally again. The casting director, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who later became a significant supporter of my career, noticed something different immediately. There was a gravity to him that hadn't been there before, she recalled years later. Not heaviness, exactly, but a sense that he'd been somewhere difficult and come back with something valuable. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he carried himself. He'd earned something that you can't fake. I didn't get the role. The director ultimately chose someone with more recent credits and fewer question marks about physical capability. But the experience of auditioning again, of standing in a room and attempting to translate my internal experience into something that could serve someone else's story, felt like a crucial step toward reclaiming the professional identity that had been interrupted by the accident. More importantly, I realized during that audition that the person I'd been before the crash, eager, ambitious, slightly desperate to prove myself, would have been devastated by the rejection. But the person I was becoming received it as simply information, data about the kind of work that was and wasn't available to me in my current state. The rejection didn't feel like a judgment on my worth as a human being, just a mismatch between what I could offer and what they needed. That shift in perspective, from personal devastation to professional assessment, marked a turning point in my recovery that had nothing to do with physical therapy or pain management. I was developing what psychologists later described as a more mature relationship with failure, an understanding that setbacks were not disasters, but simply part of the process of building any meaningful career. As autumn turned to winter in Los Angeles, my physical capabilities continued to improve gradually. I could lift heavier weights in physical therapy, could walk longer distances without exhaustion, could sleep through most nights without waking up in pain. But more significantly, I was developing a different relationship with the uncertainty that had been so terrifying in the immediate aftermath of the accident. Instead of seeing the unknown future as something to be feared or controlled, I was beginning to understand it as a space of possibility that required courage rather than certainty. The accident had taught me that planning could only go so far, that control was largely illusory, that the most important skill might be the ability to respond gracefully to whatever challenges life decided to throw at you. My mother returned to Toronto as winter settled over Los Angeles, confident that I was strong enough to manage on my own. Our goodbye at LAX was emotional in ways that surprised both of us, not because we were afraid of separation, but because we were both aware of how much we'd learned about each other during those months of crisis and recovery. "I'm proud of you," she said as we hugged carefully around my still tender ribs. "Not because you're getting better, but because of how you've handled getting better. You've become someone I didn't even know you could be." After she left, I sat in my apartment and took inventory of where I stood 8 months after the accident. Physically, I was perhaps 70% of what I'd been before, strong enough to function independently, but still limited in ways that affected my professional options. Emotionally, I was both more vulnerable and more resilient than I'd been, aware of my fragility, but also confident in my ability to endure difficulty. Professionally, I was essentially starting over, but with a different understanding of what success might mean. The desperate ambition that had driven me before the accident had been replaced by something more sustainable, a desire to do work that mattered, with people I respected, in service stories that explored the complexity of human experience rather than simply entertaining audiences. That night, I walked out to the parking lot and sat on my motorcycle for the first time since the accident. I didn't start it, didn't even put the key in the ignition. I just sat there, feeling the familiar weight and balance of the machine beneath me, remembering what it had felt like to move through the world with that particular kind of freedom and vulnerability. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was simply information, a reminder to be careful, to pay attention, to respect the power of the forces I was choosing to engage with. The accident had taught me that risk could not be eliminated from life, only managed and accepted as the price of fully participating in experience. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of Los Angeles traffic, I began to understand that the accident had given me something that most actors spend years trying to develop: authentic access to the full range of human experience. I had been broken and rebuilt, had faced mortality and chosen to continue living, had learned that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same complex truth. The person who had ridden away from this parking lot 8 months earlier had been young, eager, and fundamentally unprepared for the realities of existence in a world where anything could happen to anyone at any time. The person sitting on the bike now was older in ways that had nothing to do with calendar time, aware of his limitations, but also of his capacity to transcend them, damaged but not destroyed, scarred but somehow more complete. I still didn't know if I would ever feel comfortable writing again, if my career would survive the interruption, if the changes in my personality would ultimately help or hinder my ability to work as an actor. But I knew that the process of recovery had taught me something invaluable about resilience, about the difference between avoiding suffering and learning from it, about the way that breaking can sometimes be the necessary prelude to becoming stronger. The motorcycle sat quietly beneath me, patient and powerful, waiting for me to decide whether courage was stronger than fear. Inside my apartment, scripts waited to be read, auditions waited to be scheduled, a future waited to be built from the materials that remained after everything I'd thought I could count on had been stripped away. For the first time since the accident, I felt ready to find out what kind of person I could become if I stopped trying to recover who I'd been before and started exploring who I might be capable of being now. The accident had ended one version of my life, but it had also created the conditions for a different kind of beginning. In the silence of that Los Angeles parking lot, surrounded by the evidence of my old life and the possibilities of whatever came next, I finally understood that the crash had not been the worst thing that ever happened to me. It had been the thing that made everything else possible. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 11 months after the accident. Keanu, my agent's voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard in almost a year. I need you to sit down. Are you sitting down? I was standing in my kitchen, coffee mug halfway to my lips, watching the Los Angeles sunrise paint me apartment walls gold. The same ritual, the same light, the same apartment. But I was not the same person who had lived here before the crash. What is it, Michael? River Phoenix wants to meet with you. River Phoenix. Even saying the name felt surreal. At 23, Phoenix was already Hollywood royalty, the kind of actor who could choose any project, work with any director, command any salary. He was everything I'd dreamed of becoming before my life was interrupted by the sound of metal scraping against asphalt and the long silence that followed. There's a project, Michael continued. Independent film, but serious backing. Gus Van Sant directing, Rivers attached as the lead, and he specifically asked about you for the second role. My hand began to shake, not from nerves, though those were certainly present, but from the physical memory of trauma. 11 months later, my body still responded to high-stress situations with tremors that reminded me how close I'd come to losing everything. He asked about me specifically. Apparently, he saw some of your earlier work before the accident. But Keanu, I need to be honest with you. This isn't a charity case. Van Sant wants to meet with you, but he doesn't know about the crash. He doesn't know about the recovery, the time away, any of it. As far as he's concerned, you're just another actor who's been selective about projects. Selective. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had nearly consumed everything I'd worked for. In Hollywood terminology, being selective was vastly preferable to being damaged goods, but we both knew which description was more accurate. What's the role? I asked, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. Street hustler. Physically demanding. There are fight scenes, chase sequences, some pretty intense emotional work. It's not going to be easy, and they'll need someone who can handle the physical requirements without question. Physical requirements. The phrase sent a familiar spike of pain through my left side, phantom memoria of broken ribs, and the long months of learning to breathe properly again. Could I handle fight scenes? Could I run convincingly? Could I perform physical actions without the constant awareness of my own fragility that had become second nature during recovery? When do they want to meet? Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Keanu, this is it. This is the kind of role that changes careers. But you need to be completely honest with yourself about whether you're ready. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for 20 minutes, staring at the phone as if it might ring again and reveal that the conversation had been some elaborate mistake. River Phoenix wanted to work with me. Gus Van Sant wanted to meet with me. 11 months after I'd been lying in a hospital bed wondering if my career was over before it had truly begun, I was being offered the exact kind of opportunity that could resurrect everything. But was I ready? I walked to the bathroom mirror, The same mirror where I'd practiced monologues before the accident, back when confidence felt like something I could simply put on with my clothes. The face looking back at me was familiar, but changed. Thinner than before, with lines around the eyes that spoke of pain endured and overcome. My left shoulder sat slightly lower than my right, a permanent reminder of the impact that had shattered 4 ribs and punctured a lung. The scars were mostly invisible now, hidden beneath skin that had healed and hair that had grown back. But I could see them, could trace with my fingertip the precise locations where glass and asphalt had rewritten the geography of my body. Would cameras be able to see them too? Would audiences recognize something broken in my movement? Some hesitation that betrayed the fact that I was no longer the fearless young man I'd been before physics had taught me a lesson about vulnerability? That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since the accident. I went to the parking lot and started my motorcycle. The engine turned over immediately, that familiar rumble vibrating through my chest and awakening muscle memories that predated the crash. For a moment, sitting there with the bike idling beneath him, I felt like my old self, confident, capable, ready to take on whatever the world might throw at me. Then I tried to put it in gear. My left hand, gripping the clutch lever, began to shake uncontrollably. Not from weakness. Months off physical therapy had restored most of my strength, but from the psychological weight of memory. The last time I'd operated this machine, it had nearly killed me. The last time I trusted it with my life, I'd ended up bleeding on Sunset Boulevard while paramedics discussed whether I would ever walk normally again. I sat there for 10 minutes, engine running, unable to make the simple motion that would put the bike in first gear and allow me to move forward. Cars passed by on the street, their drivers completely unaware that they were witnessing a young man's battle with his own fear, with the question off whether courage was stronger than trauma. Finally, I turned off the engine and went back inside. The next day, I arrived at Gus Van Sant's office 30 minutes early, wearing my best shirt and carrying a portfolio of headshots that predated my time in the hospital. The waiting room was filled with the usual collection of young actors, each of them radiating the kind of casual confidence I'd once possessed but could no longer quite access. Keanu Reeves? The assistant's voice cut through my internal anxiety like a blade. Mr. Van Sant will see you now. Gus Van Sant looked exactly like what you'd expect from an independent film director. Intelligent, slightly disheveled, with the kind of intense gaze that suggested he saw things other people missed. River Phoenix sat beside him, more beautiful in person than he appeared on screen, with that particular combination of vulnerability and strength that made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Keanu, Van Sant said, gesturing to a chair across from them. River's been telling me about your work. Says you have something special. Something special. I wondered if that would still be true when they learned about the months of recovery, the lingering physical limitations, the fear that sometimes woke me up in the middle of the night with phantom pain radiating through my chest. Tell us about yourself, River said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than the performative interest that characterized most Hollywood meetings. What draws you to acting? It was a simple question, the kind I'd answered in dozens of auditions before the accident. But sitting there, under the scrutiny of 2 artists I deeply respected, I found myself unable to give the rehearsed response I'd prepared. Instead, something raw and honest emerged. I used to think acting was about becoming someone else, I said, surprised by the sound of my own voice. About escaping yourself, disappearing into a character who was braver or stronger or more interesting than you actually were. But recently, I've started to think it might be the opposite. Maybe it's about finding the parts of yourself that you didn't know existed, and using them to tell stories that matter. Van Sant and Phoenix exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read. Had I said too much? Revealed too much of the philosophical journey that pain and recovery had forced me to take? That's interesting, Van Sant said slowly. Because this role, Mike Waters, he's someone who's been broken by life, but refuses to stay broken. He's surviving on the streets, making impossible choices, finding dignity in circumstances that would destroy most people. The question is whether you can access that kind of resilience authentically. Resilience. The word hit me like a physical blow because it described exactly what I'd been learning about for the past 11 months. Not the absence of breaking, but the ability to rebuild. Not the avoidance of pain, but the transformation of pain into something useful. I like to read with River, I said, the words emerging before I'd consciously decided to speak them. If that's possible. They handed me sides from the script. A scene where Mike Waters confronts his own mortality while trying to protect someone he cares about. As I read through the lines, I realized that the character's emotional journey paralleled my own experience almost exactly. The terror of losing everything, the slow process of finding strength in vulnerability, the discovery that survival sometimes requires a different kind of courage than you'd previously understood. River fed me lines with generous attention, giving me everything I needed to find the truth in the scene. But as we worked through the material, something unexpected happened. Instead of trying to hide my recent experiences, the fear, the pain, the long climb back toward functionality, I found myself drawing on them directly. The tremor in my voice when Mike talks about being afraid wasn't manufactured for the character. It was my own authentic response to discussing fear with people whose opinion mattered to me. Jesus, River said quietly when we finished the scene. Where did that come from? Where had it come from? From 11 months of learning that authenticity was more powerful than artifice. From discovering that the things that broke you could also be the things that made you interesting. From understanding that the difference between a good actor and a great one might be a willingness to use your own damage in service of someone else's story. I've had some experiences recently, I said carefully, that have given me access to certain emotions I didn't have before. Van Sant leaned forward in his chair. What kind of experiences? This was the moment I'd been dreading since Michael had called with news of the audition. The moment when I would have to decide whether to reveal the truth about the accident, the recovery, the months away from the industry. In Hollywood, authenticity was valued until it became inconvenient, and nothing was more inconvenient than an actor who might not be able to deliver on the physical demands of a role. But looking at River Phoenix, seeing the genuine interest in his eyes, I realized that lies would serve noon. These were artists who valued truth above convenience, who were more interested in what I could bring to their story than in maintaining some fiction about my professional reliability. I was in a motorcycle accident 11 months ago. I said, the words feeling strange and dangerous as they left my mouth. Broken ribs, punctured lung, spent months in recovery. I'm fine now, physically capable of doing the work, but the experience changed me. Changed how I think about vulnerability, about survival, about what it means to be human in a world where everything can change in an instant. The silence that followed felt eternal. I could see them processing the information, weighing the risks off working with someone whose recent past included serious injury and extended absence from the industry. In Hollywood mathematics, I was a liability pretending to be an asset, damaged goods hoping to pass for quality merchandise. But then Rivers spoke, and his words changed everything. That's exactly what Mike Waters needs, he said to Van Sant. Someone who understands what it's like to have your life completely disrupted, to have to rebuild yourself from nothing. Someone who knows that strength isn't about avoiding damage, it's about surviving it. Van Sant nodded slowly. The role is yours if you want it, but I need to know you can handle the physical demands. There are scenes that will require you to run, to fight, to put your body at risk in controlled ways. Can you do that? Could I? The question reverberated through every cell of my recovering body. Could I trust my ribs to absorb impact? Could I run without the constant awareness of my own fragility? Could I perform physical actions convincingly while carrying the knowledge of how quickly and completely physical capability could be stripped away? Yes, I said, and as the word left my mouth, I realized it was true. Not because the fear was gone. It would always be there, a permanent reminder of the day my invincibility had been shattered on Sunset Boulevard. But because I learned the difference between being afraid and being paralyzed by fear. The accident had taught me that safety was largely illusion, but it had also taught me that I could survive more than I'd ever imagined possible. That evening, I called my mother with the news. "Theodore," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I'm so proud of you." Not because you got a role, but because you had the courage to try for it. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment as darkness fell over Los Angeles. Tomorrow, I would begin preparation for the most challenging role of my career, working with actors whose talent intimidated and performing scenes that would require me to access parts of myself I was still learning to understand. The prospect was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But tonight, there was something else I needed to do. I went to the parking lot and sat on my motorcycle in the darkness. The metal was cold beneath me, the familiar weight and balance triggering muscle memories that predated trauma. For months, this machine had represented everything I was afraid of: speed, vulnerability, the possibility of catastrophic loss of control. Now, it felt like something else, a test of whether I could move forward with my life or remain forever trapped by the memory of one terrible afternoon. I put the key in the ignition, started the engine, felt the familiar rumble vibrate through my chest, awakening something that had been sleeping for 11 months. This time, when I reached for the clutch lever, my hand was steady. I pulled in the clutch, clicked the bike into first gear, and slowly released pressure on the lever. The motorcycle began to move forward, carrying me out of the parking lot and onto the street where I'd lived for the past year, but hadn't truly traveled since the accident. The first few blocks were terrifying. Every car felt like a potential threat. Every intersection like a place where lives could be shattered by momentary inattention. But gradually, as muscle memory reasserted itself and the rhythm of riding returned to my body, the fear began to transform into something else. Not the absence of danger, but the acceptance of it as the price of fully participating in life. I rode through the Hollywood Hills as midnight approached, following the same routes I'd traveled countless times before the accident. But now, every curve in the road felt like a choice, not just about direction, but about the kind of person I wanted to be. Someone who let fear define his boundaries, or someone who acknowledged fear while refusing to be controlled by it. When I finally returned to my apartment, parking the bike in the same space it had occupied for 11 months, I felt fundamentally different than I had that morning. Not healed. Healing was an ongoing process that would continue for years, but transformed. The accident had broken my body and shattered my assumptions about safety and control. Tonight, for the first time since the crash, I'd chosen to embrace risk again. As I walked back to my apartment, I realized that the young man who had ridden away from this parking lot 11 months ago was gone forever. But the person walking back into the building was someone new, scarred but stronger, afraid but not paralyzed, aware of his fragility but no longer defined by it. In 2 weeks, I would report to the set of My Own Private Idaho and begin the work of bringing Mike Waters to life. I would draw on experiences I'd never wanted to have, use pain I'd never chosen to endure, and transform the worst thing that had ever happened to me into something that served art and story. The accident had taught me that control was an illusion, that safety was temporary, that everything you think you can count on can disappear in the space between one heartbeat and the next. But a night, riding through Los Angeles with the wind cutting through my thoughts and the engine humming beneath me, I'd learned something else. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act meaningfully in spite of it. I was 25 years old, standing in a parking lot in West Hollywood, holding the keys to a motorcycle that had nearly killed me and a career that had been resurrected by my willingness to transform suffering into strength. Tomorrow, I would wake up and begin preparing for the role that would change everything. Tonight, I was simply a young man who had discovered that breaking could be the beginning of becoming whole. The stars above Los Angeles looked exactly the same as they had on that Sunday morning 11 months ago, when I'd been invincible and immortal and entirely unprepared for the lessons that pain would teach me about resilience. But I was no longer looking at them from the ground, broken and wondering if I would survive. I was standing on my own feet, breathing easily, ready to take risks again because I finally understood the difference between courage and recklessness, between survival and surrender. The accident had ended one version of my life. Tonight, I had chosen to begin another. 27 years later, I can still feel the exact moment when my life split into before and after. not the impact itself. That memory remains mercifully fragmented, a kaleidoscope of metal and asphalt and the terrible silence that followed. But the moment in that hospital bed when I realized that the person I'd been that Sunday morning was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood with cellular certainty that everything we think we can count on is borrowed time. My own private Idaho changed everything, but not in the ways I'd expected when I first read Gus Van Sant's script. The film itself was beautiful, challenging, the kind of art that reminds you why you want to be an actor in the first place. Working with River Phoenix was a masterclass in vulnerability and truth, watching him find emotional honesty in every scene while never losing sight of the larger story we were trying to tell together. But the real transformation happened in the spaces between scenes, in the quiet conversations with cast and crew who gradually recognized that I was drawing on something deeper than technique. The accident had given me access to experiences that most 25-year-olds never encounter. The terror of complete helplessness, the humility of depending on others for survival, the strange intimacy that develops when you're stripped of all pretense and forced to confront your own mortality. There's something different about him, River told a journalist during production, though the interview wouldn't be published until years later. He's got this gravity, this awareness of how fragile everything is. It makes him fearless in a completely different way than most actors. Not fearless because he thinks nothing can touch him, but fearless because he knows everything can touch him and he's decided to show up anyway. Critics noticed it too, though they struggled to articulate exactly what they were seeing. Reeves brings an unexpected weight to the role of Scott Favor, wrote the New York Times. There's amaturity in his performance that suggests experiences beyond his years, a quality of having been tested by life and emerged changed but not broken. They had no way of knowing about the 11 months of recovery, the physical therapy sessions where I relearned how to trust my own body, the nights spent staring at the ceiling and wondering if courage was stronger than fear. But somehow, all of that showed up on screen, not as performance, but as presence. The accident had taught me that authenticity was more powerful than artifice, that the things that break us can also be the things that make us useful. The success of Idaho led to other roles, bigger budgets, more visibility. Point Break came next, then Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, then the projects that would eventually make me a recognizable face around the world. But with each film, I carried the awareness that none of it was guaranteed. A career, like a body, like a life, could be interrupted at any moment by forces completely beyond our control. That awareness changed how I approached everything. Where other actors might have been calculating career moves and strategic choices, I found myself drawn to projects that felt meaningful, stories that explored the complexity of being human in a world where suffering and joy coexisted in equal measure. I wasn't interested in being a movie star. I was interested in being useful to stories that mattered. My relationship with my mother deepened in ways that surprised both of us. The months she'd spent in Los Angeles, watching over my recovery, had created a bond that transcended the typical parent-child dynamic. She'd seen me at my most vulnerable, broken, afraid, uncertain about everything I'd thought I could count on. And I'd seen her navigate an unfamiliar city with courage that reminded me where I'd inherited my own resilience. The accident changed you, she told me during one of our weekly phone calls, years after the crash. But it didn't change you into someone else. It changed you into more yourself, if that makes sense. Like it stripped away everything that wasn't essential and left you with just the parts that mattered. She was right, though it took me years to fully understand what she meant. The young man who'd ridden away from his West Hollywood apartment that October morning had been eager to become someone else, more confident, more successful, more worthy of attention and admiration. The person who returned from the hospital was no longer interested in becoming someone else. He was interested in becoming more fully himself, including the parts that were fragile and afraid and uncertain. That shift in perspective influenced every aspect of my life and work. In interviews, I found myself talking less about career ambitions and more about the privilege of being able to participate in storytelling. On sets, I was drawn to conversations about meaning and mortality rather than box office projections and award campaigns. In my personal life, I began to prioritize relationships and experiences over acquisitions and achievements. The motorcycle remained a constant throughout. Not the same bike, that one had been repaired and eventually sold to someone who didn't know its history, but others, each one chosen carefully and maintained with the kind of attention that comes from understanding how quickly mechanical systems can fail. I still rode regularly, still found meditation in the rhythm of movement and the negotiation with physics that riding required. But I rode differently now, not with the casual invincibility of youth, but with the earned wisdom of someone who understood exactly what could go wrong and had chosen to accept that risk as the price of fully participating in life. Every ride was a conversation with mortality, a decision to embrace vulnerability rather than be paralyzed by it. Friends who knew me before and after the accident often commented on the change, though they struggled to articulate it precisely. "Keanu's always been thoughtful," said David, my friend from those early struggling days. "But after the crash, he became, I don't know, more present somehow. Like he was paying attention to things the rest of us missed." What I was paying attention to, I think, was the fundamental interconnectedness of suffering and compassion. The accident had taught me that everyone, literally everyone, was carrying some form of invisible damage, navigating their own relationship with pain and fear and the basic human need for understanding. That awareness made me more sensitive to the experiences of people around me, more interested in their stories than in promoting my own. It showed up in small ways at first. Longer conversations with crew members between takes. Genuine interest in the experiences of people whose names would never appear in credits. A tendency to listen more than I spoke, to ask questions that invited authentic response rather than performing the kind-off superficial charm that Hollywood networking usually required. But gradually, it began to influence larger choices. The roles I accepted, the causes I supported, the way I moved through the world when cameras weren't recording. I wasn't trying to be a better person. That kind of conscious self-improvement would have felt performative and false. I was simply operating from a different understanding of what mattered, informed by the knowledge that life was more fragile and precious than most people realized. The years passed. The Matrix trilogy established me as an action star, though I never felt comfortable with that label. John Wick proved that audiences were hungry for stories about grief and resilience, about characters who found purpose in the aftermath of devastating loss. Critics began to notice what they called my signature melancholy, a quality of presence that suggested depth of experience beyond what the scripts explicitly contained. They were seeing the accident, though they didn't know it. Every performance was informed by those 11 months of recovery, by the lesson that strength and vulnerability were not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same complex truth. The characters I was drawn to, and the way I chose to portray them, reflected an understanding of human fragility that could only be learned through direct experience. In 2019, during the promotion for John Wick, Chapter 3, a journalist asked me about mortality, about whether I was afraid of death. It was the kind of question that younger actors might have deflected with humor or philosophy, but I found myself answering with unusual directness. "I think about mortality every day," I said. Not in a morbid way, but as a reminder that this is all temporary. The career, the success, the attention, all of it could end tomorrow. But that's not oppressing to me. It's liberating. When you really understand how little time we have, you stop wasting energy on things that don't matter. The interviewer seemed surprised by the answer, as if she'd expected something more conventional from someone promoting a blockbuster action film. But for me, it was simply the truth, the perspective that had been forged in a hospital bed 31 years earlier, when I'd realized that survival was not guaranteed and therefore infinitely precious. That understanding shaped not just my career choices, but my entire approach to living. I gave away money quietly, supported causes without publicity, tried to use whatever influence I had in service of stories and people that might not otherwise receive attention. Not because I was trying to be noble, but because the accident had taught me that we're all more connected than we usually realize, all navigating variations of the same fundamental challenges. The generosity that people sometimes commented on wasn't calculated or strategic. It emerged naturally from the recognition that I'd been given something valuable, not just survival, but the opportunity to transform suffering into service. The accident had broken my body and shattered my assumptions, but it had also cracked open something deeper, an awareness that compassion wasn't a luxury, but a necessity, the only response that made sense in a world where everyone was vulnerable and no one was immune to loss. As I write this, I'm 57 years old. The physical scars from the accident have long since faded, invisible to everyone except doctors and the occasional makeup artist who notices the slight asymmetry in my left shoulder. But the other changes, the deeper ones, continue to influence every aspect of how I move through the world. I still ride motorcycles, still take professional risks, still choose projects that require me to access parts of myself that might prefer to remain hidden. But I do all of this with an awareness that wasn't available to me before the crash. The knowledge that breaking can be the beginning of becoming whole, that survival is a skill that can be learned, that the things we think will destroy us might actually be preparing us for the most important work of our lives. The accident didn't make me a better person. That kind of simplistic transformation exists only in fairy tales and poorly written screenplays. But it did make me a different person, someone who understood viscerally that courage and fear could coexist, that strength could emerge from the acknowledgement of vulnerability, that the most authentic response to suffering might be to help others navigate their own versions of pain and recovery. Young actors sometimes ask me for advice about building a career, about making the right choices in an industry that can be brutal and arbitrary. I tell them what the accident taught me. That authenticity is more sustainable than ambition. That the things that make you different are often the things that make you valuable. That the goal isn't to avoid being broken, but to learn how to rebuild yourself in ways that serve something larger than your own survival. Sometimes they look disappointed, as if they were hoping for more tactical guidance about agents and auditions and networking strategies. But those are the easy parts. The hard part, the part that determines whether you have a career or just a series of jobs, is the work of becoming someone worth watching, someone whose presence on screen reflects genuine experience with the full spectrum of human possibility. The accident gave me that experience whether I wanted it or not. It forced me to confront mortality at 24, to rebuild my body and identity from the ground up, to discover resources of resilient side never known I possessed. It interrupted my life in the most violent way possible, but it also prepared me for a kind of work I couldn't have imagined before I understood what it meant to be genuinely afraid and choose courage anyway. Every role since then has been informed by those 11 months of recovery, by the knowledge that everyone in the audience is carrying their own invisible wounds, their own fears about fragility and loss, and the possibility that everything they count on could disappear without warning. When I perform, I'm not trying to entertain people so much as I'm trying to remind them that they're not alone in their vulnerability, that survival is possible even when it seems impossible, that breaking doesn't have to be the end of the story. The blue sedan is still out there somewhere, probably in a junkyard by now, its brief moment of intersection with my motorcycle reduced to rust and faded metal. The elderly woman who was driving it sent me a letter years later, after she'd recognized my name in a movie review and realized I was the young man from her accident. She was 91 then, still carrying guilt about that moment of confusion that had changed both our lives in ways neither of us could have anticipated. I wrote her back, thanking her for reaching out and trying to explain that the accident, as terrible as it was, had ultimately led me toward experiences and understanding I couldn't have accessed any other way. I don't know if that brought her peace, but writing the letter brought me something close to gratitude. Not for the pain itself, but for what the pain had taught me about resilience, about compassion, about the difference between surviving and thriving. That October afternoon in 1988, when I was flying through the air at 45 miles per hour with no control over my destination, I couldn't have imagined the person I would become because of that moment. The young man who left his apartment that morning, full of ambition and casual confidence in his own invincibility, was gone forever. But the person who emerged from months of recovery was someone capable of work and relationships, and understanding that the younger version of me had never been prepared for. The accident broke my body, but it also broke open possibilities I'd never known existed. It taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act meaningfully in spite of it. It showed me that authenticity is more powerful than perfection, that vulnerability can be a source of strength rather than weakness, that the things we survive can become the foundation of everything that matters most in our lives. 35 years later, I still think about that moment of impact every time I get on a motorcycle, every time I take a professional risk, every time I have to choose between comfort and growth. Not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what's possible when you refuse to let breaking be the end of your story. The silence that followed the crash was the deepest I'd ever experienced, the complete absence of sound that exists in the space between one life and the next. But what emerged from that silence was a voice I'd never heard before, my own, finally honest enough to be useful, finally vulnerable and not to be strong. That voice has guided every choice since. It led me to roles that required me to access pain I'd never wanted to experience. It shaped relationships built on mutual recognition of fragility rather than performative strength. It informed a way of moving through the world that prioritizes meaning over achievement, connection over success, service over self-promotion. The accident didn't make me a better actor. It made me a more honest one. It didn't cure me of fear. It taught me how to work with fear as a creative partner rather than fighting it as an enemy. It didn't eliminate uncertainty from my life. It showed me that uncertainty could be a source of possibility rather than paralysis. Most importantly, it taught me that the goal isn't to become invincible, but to become useful. To survive whatever breaks you, and then use that survival in service of stories and relationships and experiences that matter. To understand that everyone is carrying invisible damage, and that our job, as artists, as humans, as temporary residents of this fragile world, is to help each other navigate the darkness with whatever light we've managed to kindle from our own burning. The young man who rode away from his West Hollywood apartment on October 15, 1988, was seeking something he couldn't quite name. The person I became in the aftermath of that ride discovered that what he'd been seeking was the courage to be authentically himself, completely broken and completely whole, afraid and brave simultaneously, mortal and somehow, because of that mortality, finally alive in a way that mattered. Every ride since then has been both an act of remembrance and an act of faith, a recognition that the world remains as dangerous and beautiful as it was that Sunday morning, but that danger and beauty are not obstacles to be avoided, but experiences to be embraced with whatever wisdom we've managed to earn through surviving everything that was supposed to destroy us. The silence after impact lasted only seconds, but its echo continues to inform every choice I make. In that silence, I learned the difference between existing and living, between performing and being present, between success and significance. Everything worthwhile that has happened in my life since then began in that moment of perfect quiet, when I realized I was still alive and had to decide what kind of person I wanted to become with this unexpected gift of continued existence. I chose to become someone who remembered what it felt like to be broken and used that memory to help others feel less alone in their own breaking. The accident ended one story but began a better one. Not easier, not safer, but truer to what it means to be human in a world where everything well of is temporary and therefore infinitely precious. That story is still being written, one choice at a time, one role at a time, one day of survival transformed into service at a time. The accident that was supposed to end everything instead became the beginning of everything that mattered. In breaking me, it made me whole. In silencing me, it gave me a voice. In teaching me to die, it finally taught me how to live. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be with us discovering the secrets and untold sides of the most famous lives in history.